Over the past 8 weeks or so, we have been walking through a sermon series called Broken Kings. And I pray it's been blessing your life because it has been blessing mine. But just in case you haven't been spending time with us these past 8 weeks, or maybe you have been with us and you're like, I need a little bit of a refresher of what we talked about these past 8 weeks. I'm going to run it down for you real quick, okay? All right, so we started in the book of Ruth. And we took notice of how even when you can't see God, he's always working. We then moved on and we talked about a disobedient king over in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And we looked at the kingship of Saul. And we saw how faithfulness to God exercises the authority given by God under the authority of God. Y'all remember that one? Then we talked about a displeasing king. We went over to 2 Samuel chapter 11, and we viewed the failings of King David. And in that, we saw how faithfulness to God, it calls us to be on guard against sin. Then we moved on along some more to a divided king over in 1 Kings chapter 11, and we talked about Solomon. We looked at his disloyalty, and we saw how the faithfulness of God does not divide its loyalty amongst others. Then we begin to shift our focus, and we begin to shift our gaze in this series from these insufficient kings to an all-sufficient God. And then from there, we landed in Psalms 91, where we identified that God is our refuge. Then we ventured over to 1 Chronicles 21, and we discussed how God's mercy is not to let you off the hook in life, but his purpose is to lead you to return to him in your heart. Then we went on to 2 Chronicles 36 and took note of how the faithfulness of God persistently pursues his purpose and his people. And then last week, Pastor Curtis took us to Ezra 7, where he pointed out to us why we can trust the Bible. All right, so that's 8 weeks. I just ran it down for you, just a quick recap. But today, we are coming to the end of our Broken King sermon series. And just as we started with the story of a woman named Ruth, today we will end this series parsing through the story of God in the life of a woman by the name of Esther. A story where, much like Ruth, we don't really hear God speak. And in Esther, we don't even hear God mentioned, but we can still see traces of his hand at work. And so today, as I was preparing, trying to hear from the Lord so I can give it to the people, I came across an interesting video. It's a video by a Christian woman, a former Christian woman turned atheist, and she was expressing some of her frustrations with the Christian faith. And one of the things that she said that I thought was interesting didn't necessarily center around whether or not God existed, but it was this sentiment that we Christians, that we have our work cut out for us in proving that God is in any way good or that he interacts with the world. And it made me pause. One, because it made me question or wonder what experience did this woman have that made it impossible for her to reconcile that a good God exists and that he is involved in the details of our lives. And as I continue to reflect, y'all, if I'm honest, I could understand where she was coming from. I thought about my own life experiences. And to be honest, I get it. There have been times when I struggled to believe and trust that God was present in my own life, in my own circumstance, because I couldn't trace his hand. I couldn't see any hint of him being at work when I found myself in some of the most troubling times in my life. Is that a part of anybody else's testimony? I just want to make sure I'm in the right room. Like, there is something about being in trouble and not being able to sense God's presence or his nearness. It's unsettling for us. And if we're not careful, it will cause us to believe that at some point, God jumped ship and he left us to figure out how to keep our lives afloat. Certain life experiences has that kind of effect. It's hard for us to see God's hand at work. And it's not lost on me that the sins of humanity, our experiences with broken people, with broken systems, our experience with pain and with tragedy, it all has a way of hindering our ability to see God in it. It blinds us to the goodness of God. I get it. It's difficult to find yourself in trouble and wonder if God is going to come to your rescue. But even in those moments, y'all, when we feel like God has left us, those feelings may seem valid, but I want to assure you this morning that they are not true. That the story of Esther is one that pushes back on this notion of God being a God who would ghost his people. This story dispels this notion that God isn't one to get involved in the details of our lives. Through the story of Esther, we learn that when trouble and uncertainty arises, God is present. And not only is he present, but he is at work to protect and to deliver his people. And so that brings me to our main idea for today. Our main idea, if you could write it down, our pastor says that good students, that they take notes. Oh, y'all thought because he won't hear, that y'all won't go hear that. Okay, let me go ahead and dispel that for you now. Our main idea for today is that even when it seems like God is missing, we can trust that he is present and at work. Even when it seems like God is missing, we can trust that he is present and he is at work. That even when there is no mention of God, he is still on the scene. When a king of God's people is not sitting on the throne, God is still at work and he's working through his people. And so if you have your Bibles, you can turn with me. If you have your phone, you can scroll with me. If you don't have anything, it's all good. We have it on the screen for you. Just meet me in Esther 4, and we're going to start at verse 6. Now Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went and told Esther what Mordecai said. And then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come into the king these 30 days. And then then they told Mordecai what Esther had said. Then Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Peep his response. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go gather the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. The story of Esther, just a little context, takes place in the Persian capital of Susa, and this is happening about 100 years after the Babylonian exile. So just in case you aren't familiar with this Babylonian exile, that's okay, I got another recap for you. Under the leadership of the various kings of Israel and of Judah, the people failed to uphold their covenant obligations. They were out here, as we say, they were out in these streets, and they were completely wild, and they broke all of the commandments, and they began to engage in idol worship. They were rejecting God and turning from God. They practiced this thing called syncretism, where they would mesh the worship practices of pagan gods with their worship of Yahweh. And God, in his grace and his mercy, he sent prophets to warn the king and the people time and time again, y'all. But time and time again, they completely disregarded God's warnings. And so God said, all right, bet. God resolved to send them into exile because of their rebellion. We read that the temple is destroyed and they are ripped from the land that God had promised to give them. And the Jews would spend 70 years in Babylonian captivity, exactly as it had been prophesied by the prophet Jeremiah. But in the breath of that same prophecy, God also promised to restore them and bring them back from the place where he sent them into exile. And y'all, as God does, he kept his promise. Because at the end of 70 years, we read that the Lord stirs the spirit of a Persian king by the name of Cyrus, who makes this proclamation, allowing for the exiles to go back to Jerusalem in order to rebuild the temple. And some of the Jews, not all, but some of the Jews whose spirit God also stirred up, they responded to Cyrus's decree, and they made the journey back to Jerusalem so that they could begin to rebuild the temple. And we read this week that Nehemiah also ventured back. He ventured back with a fourth group of exiles to start rebuilding the walls. Now, as the Jews began the work of rebuilding the temple and rebuilding the wall, their efforts were not welcomed. They began to face opposition and they faced the threat. Now, while that is significant, what we have to remember about this particular generation is that the generation that was alive when they were originally taken into exile, they have died out. This generation that is returning back to Jerusalem, they didn't experience God in the same way that their ancestors had. They didn't see God perform the miracles, such as manna coming from heaven. They didn't see God part the Red Sea. They didn't experience God at Mount Sinai. So their understanding of God is not the same as their ancestors. This generation would have been the ones hearing and reading about this story of Esther. And so to avoid making the same grave mistakes as the previous generations of Israelites, it was critical that they came to know God, that they knew his heart, that they knew his character. And that brings us to Esther. Situated between the time of the temple's reconstruction and the rebuilding of the walls is the story of a Jewish girl named Esther. And in the face of what felt like the greatest opposition and threat, God reveals his power, and he demonstrates his faithfulness by using Esther to deliver his people from destruction. Now, through this story, God looks to encourage the Babylonian and Persian Jews and those who have already returned back to Jerusalem. He wants to show them his providential ability and willingness to preserve them against their enemies. Remember, this audience has not experienced God in the same way that their ancestors have. So with the story of Esther, God's desire is that they might know him deeply so that they can follow him fully. Amen. Now, although the Jews were without a king, they were not without a God. Even if it does seem that he is silent concerning their issue, God didn't need a king in place to serve his purpose. He just needed a willing vessel. And so we see in the passage that we read a man by the name of Mordecai, who is the cousin of Esther, who has raised her as his own daughter, makes her aware of a serious matter. And it requires her attention and it requires her involvement. The Jews are being targeted by a man named Haman. Back in chapter 3, Haman has beef with Mordecai because Mordecai refuses to bow to him. Now, Haman had just recently been promoted by the king, and the king put in a command that those who come into the presence of Haman, you are to bow to him. But Mordecai really wasn't the bowing type. He was not the type to bow to this man Haman, and this made Haman furious. And so Haman decides that it's not enough to just lay hands on Mordecai, It's not enough to hem him up. But Haman plots to destroy all of the Jews throughout the kingdom of King Ahasuerus. The Jews, hearing this news, as you can imagine, are in despair. They are lamenting. They are grieving. They are in desperate need of an intervention. Now, if you read through Esther up until this point, we have not heard God. We have not heard God mentioned. So what does God do to respond to the dangers that are confronting the Jews? Well, he puts a young Jewish woman on the throne. Let's look at Esther chapter 2. When Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal place in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebeth, in the 7th year of his reign, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So how does God respond? God puts Esther on the throne. Some context here. In chapters 1 and 2, we read about this other Persian king named King Ahasuerus or Xerxes, depending on the translation that you're reading. We read how he had this grand banquet. Now, during the time of all this partying that he was doing, he makes a request that the queen at that time, Queen Vashti, that she would be brought to them wearing her crown because he wanted to show her off. Now, there is a lot of speculation as to what exactly he was communicating and asking her to come with her crown on. But we really don't know what it says because the text isn't really explicit as to what that means. But what we do know, Vashti said, "No, I'm good on that. I'm not doing that. I'm not coming." She was about like Mordecai with Haman. I'm not really the coming when you call me type in this situation. And so as a result of her refusing the king's request, he is furious, and we read that she is deposed, meaning she is stripped of her royal position and she is banished from the king's presence. And now this creates a void, as you might imagine, that the king is ready to fill. And so based on historians, that he would gather approximately 400. That's just a lot of people. He would gather 400 young virgin women to be candidates as queen. And out of the 400, he is smitten by this young Jewish woman named Esther. So much so that he would crown her queen. Y'all, this would happen approximately about 5 or 6 years before Haman's plot was even put into play. So what am I saying? That Esther's ascent to the throne is a proactive strategy. And Mordecai, her cousin, he recognizes this. Look at what he says in verse 14. He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish." Here it is. "And who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this." Mordecai, he says this to Esther after Esther initially pushes back on his appeal to go to the king on behalf of the people. And the reason why she pushes back is because of Persian law. We read about it earlier. The law says that anyone who would come into the king's inner court without being called or summoned by the king, that the only response is for them to be put to death. Unless he held out the golden scepter, you would live. Esther pushing back on Mordecai's request, I get it. What he is asking is risky business. He is asking her to put her in a position where she might not even have a chance to intercede. Yeah, she's just going to be sentenced to death. So Esther pushing back, I get that. It's dangerous. But Mordecai isn't hearing any of that. He persistently pursues his appeal to Esther to approach the king. Why? Because he recognizes that Esther coming to her royal position at such a critical time is no coincidence, but that there is a divine hand at work. Here is the sentiment. Esther becoming the queen wasn't really about her beauty. It really wasn't even about the king's satisfaction with her when she went to him. But Esther's placement on the throne was the hand of God at work for the purpose of delivering his covenant people or leveraging and delivering them from destruction. God leverages Esther's beauty and this favor that she's gained from the king and everyone who saw her to put her in a position to intercede on behalf of her people that they might escape Haman's plot of destruction. So Mordecai, he also appeals to Esther because he knows that as the queen, she may not have the same authority as the king, but she has access to the king. She has access to the one who has authority in this matter. And not only does she have access, y'all, she has influence because she has favor with said king. God shows us that he will use anything that we possess for his purpose to position us that we might be willing vessels for his plan. God had chosen Esther for such a time as this to be an instrument in his hand and a solution to a problem. Can I ask you, what might God be trying to leverage in your own life for his purposes? How might God be trying to use your talents, your gifts, and your abilities, your knowledge? How might he be trying to leverage that to put you in a position for his purpose? God positioning Esther on the throne, I want us to see this. It displays three things. The first thing that it displays is his sovereignty. His sovereignty. What is sovereignty? Where sovereignty is this Christianese word, if you will. It means that he is preeminent in power and authority. That he rules over the universe. He is in total control of all things. That he has power, that he has wisdom, that he has authority to do anything he chooses to do within his creation whenever he desires to do it. The second thing we see displayed is his providence. What is providence? Providence, it speaks to God's strong, undeniable influence by which he cares for and directs all things in the universe. Because he is sovereign, he can exercise providence. And the third thing is his faithful love. This is the one that kind of hits for me. Because God's love towards the children of Israel, towards the Jews, didn't change, even though they chose to stay in a place where they had been exiled instead of returning back to Jerusalem. Now, this resolve to remain in a place of exile, it subtly communicates a rejection of God's promise to restore them and bring them back to the place that he had promised them. To remain in the place of exile is a decision to not go back and help with the rebuilding of the temple. And you may be asking yourself, why is that such a big deal? Because rebuilding the temple symbolized reconciliation with God. It was a recommitment to their covenant obligations, those same covenant obligations that their ancestors had received and had broken. Rebuilding the temple, it indicated that God would once again be the center of their worship. And they chose not to go back and be a part of that. They chose to stay in a place where they had been exiled. They chose to stay in a place among pagan people who did not even revere or acknowledge their God. They chose to stay. Yet, regardless of their reasoning, God was still gracious towards them. He still considered them to be a part of his covenant people. Theologians would point this out, that this would be the deeper and more significant purpose of the book of Esther, to demonstrate that the post-exilic Jews, including those who didn't return to Jerusalem, that they remained God's chosen people. God remained faithful to his covenant to Israel that they would be his people and he would be their God. And we see that he does not abandon this covenant, even with the ones who chose to stay and not go back to Jerusalem. And I think this is good news for us, that this is the confidence that we have in our own sufficient God, our own sufficient King. Because of his great love for us, he doesn't ghost us when we encounter trouble and suffering and grief, even if we're experiencing those things because of our own doing. But because of his love for us, he moves behind the scenes to bring relief and to bring deliverance for his people. Hear me, even when it seems like God is MIA, when you can't seem to trace his hand, you can't hear him, you've been praying, you've been fasting, and you can't hear him, I want to assure you that that is no indication that he is not present. He has not abandoned you. I know what it looks like. I know how you're feeling, but I just want to tell you, he has not left you. He has not abandoned you. He has not left you hanging. We can trust that he is at work, that he is present, and he is doing a work through his people. You might ask me, how can I be sure? It's because God didn't just do this in the life of Esther, y'all. He didn't just do this here in this story with Esther, but can I run you back a few chapters or a few books? He did it in the life of Joseph, who was sold into slavery by his own brothers. And he would go through quite a few unfortunate events as a slave. And yet, God was with him and would put him where from slave, he would take him to second in command of all of Egypt. And now Joseph is in a position during this severe famine. He is in position to save his family and his father, Israel. And he's able to save those brothers who sent them into slavery in the first place. What about the life of Moses? God would raise him up to lead Israel out of Egypt after God has heard the groanings of his people who are being severely oppressed by the Egyptians. He would not leave them there to continue in that oppression, but he would raise up Moses to lead them to a land that he'd promised them. And I dare not forget how God would place Jesus in a broken world, in a garment of flesh at the fullness of time for the purpose of Calvary, so that we can be reconciled back to the Father and delivered from the grips and penalty of sin. I know that it seems like God is missing, but one thing is for certain, he is there. And he is at work. Spoiler alert. Esther decides to go to the king. When she goes to the king, she exposes Haman's plot. Haman, in turn, he is executed. He's executed in the same way that he had planned for Mordecai. The king then gives Mordecai authority. Mordecai then is able to issue a counter decree. Since Haman's decree couldn't be revoked, he's allowing for the Jews now to defend themselves. And if you keep reading through Esther, you'll see that this proves to be beneficial because the Jews are able to defend themselves and they're able to triumph over their enemies. Once again, God has shown up and preserved his people in the face of threat and opposition. So what are we to do with this? Because for some of us, we're still in situations where we can't trace God's hand. And I know you might be saying, hey, Adriana, that sounds good and dandy, but I'm in the thick of things. How am I supposed to keep a right gaze of God? Well, one of the things we see in this story is that in the midst of his despair, Mordecai was convinced that God would not leave his people to be destroyed. He was very much convinced that God had not abandoned his people. He was convinced that he would deliver them from the hands of their enemies. He says it again in verse 14. He says, "For if you keep silent at this time, Relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. Whoa, Mordecai. He was convinced. He was sure that deliverance would come whether Esther got involved or not. And I think what Mordecai models for us is a posture of hope that we ourselves can practice. When we find ourselves in the midst of trouble, we find ourselves in the midst of uncertainty, and we are struggling, and we can't see God's hand. We can't trace his hand. So how can we be like Mordecai? What are some practical things that we can do to help us maintain a right view of God when we're experiencing this trouble and uncertainty? The first thing I want to encourage you to do is to remember. I want you to remember. Remember what God has already done. I don't know about you, but there are times where I have to sit, and sometimes I've gotten to the point now where, because I'm getting a little older, so I be forgetting stuff sometimes. So I have to write down when God has shown up for me. And when I find myself in a place where I can't trace his hand, I can't see what is happening. Like, Lord, are you even here? Do you see what's going on? Because it is ghetto around here. Do you see what's happening? I can go back and say, well, God has delivered me through. Okay, God has been faithful. He's been faithful. Here, he has kept me. You have to go back into and remember what God has already done. And so in remembering, I want you to write this down. We won't read it, but I want you to write it down. As you're remembering, I want you to meditate on Psalm 77. And just meditate on verses 11 through 15. Just meditate as you remember what God has already done. And then the second thing I want to encourage you to do is to give thanks. Give thanks. Thank God for what he has already done and what God is doing. Thank him for what he has already done and what he is doing. And as you are giving thanks, I want you to meditate on Psalms 9. Again, we won't read it. I want you to meditate on Psalms 9 in those first two verses. Remember and give thanks. Remember and give thanks. And so, thank you, Lord. As you go through the rest of the week, maybe you run into a situation. I come from a church that says if you're not in a trial, just keep living. If you're not facing trouble, just keep living. If you're not facing uncertainty, just keep living. But no matter what you face this week, no matter how big or small it is, I want you to know that God is working. I want you to know that you are seen, and I want to encourage you to trust God. God is working. You are seen. Trust God. God is working. You are seen. I love what Hagar said. She called him El Roy, a God who sees. You are seen. So trust God.